Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of my mini-series Declassified, a counterpart to my regular reviews where I take a look at the real-world costs and considerations behind a number of iconic cars. Today I'm taking a look at one of Porsche's shortest-lived models, the 968. In production from just 1991 to 1995, the 968 was the final chapter in the four-cylinder transaxle story that began with the 924 back in 1976. Revered when new and today praised as a genuine classic, the 968 remains relatively affordable, particularly when compared with the air-cooled 911s of the era. So I figured it was about time to reappraise one of Stuttgart's forgotten sons. Ahead of today's video, I want to say a massive thank you to Dodo Juice, who have agreed to renew their sponsorship for this year and also become the headline sponsors for Declassified. Over the last 7 months, this car has been looked after exclusively using Dodo Juice products, which means even in the Scottish winter, it still looks absolutely fabulous. It's currently sporting a coating of their hard candy wax and looks utterly sensational. And don't forget, if you want to get your hands on any Dodo Juice products, I've secured a 10% discount for you all to use at the official Dodo Juice store. Just use my code JAYEMM10 or follow the link in the description down below. For those who don't know, this isn't just any old 968, it is my 968. I've owned it for about 18 months now, in which time I have greatly enjoyed the experience. It is also a car with a fantastic history, having been supplied new to Porsche Reading back in 1992. That same year, it was also the very car used on the Porsche stand at the British Motor Show to sell the then new 968. It came with a very modest but tasteful specification. Remember, this was 1992. Porsche options lists were not as they are now. So it has this stunning cobalt blue paint, these side strips which were an option that I really don't like, the colour-coded bridge spoiler at the back, which I do, and inside grey leather with blue piping and sport seats. The history of the Transaxle lineup is fairly well documented. As mentioned, it began with the 924 back in 1976, a car developed by Porsche for Volkswagen. However, changing economic conditions meant VW felt it wasn't the right time to introduce an all-new sports car, so Porsche opted to buy the rights to it and produce their own version. In 1982, they introduced the much-improved 944, now featuring, in place of the VW lump, a Porsche-built engine. This was wildly popular and sold very well throughout the 1980s. However, come the 1990s and things had changed, not just for the model, but Porsche as a whole. They were struggling. They needed something new, but they didn't really have the cash to do it. So, in order to keep things fresh, it was decided to introduce a third generation of the 944. But along the way, it was decided so many changes had been made, the car deserved a new name. So, the 944 S3 became the 968. The fact is that Porsche were well aware they were desperately in need of fresh new models, a clean break with the past. However, in the early 90s, they simply didn't have the resources. So, while they awaited the arrival of what became the 996 and the Boxster, they created a pair of stopgap cars that became legends in their own right. This, the 968, and also the 993. At the time, Porsche claimed this was some 80% different to the outgoing 944, and while that may be something of a stretch, there certainly is enough different about it to make it feel like its own thing. Though it still carries the same overall body shape as the 944, from front to back, there are many changes to make this visually very distinctive. So, at the front we have a new treatment for the bumper with a smoother, rounder look, somewhat previewing that which was to come in the later 993. Though it doesn't appear to have pop-up headlights, it does. Here you have a system similar to that on the higher-end 928, where they're constantly in view and then just lift out a little bit. Personally, I don't think they look that great. I'm actually more a fan of the look of the 944 Turbo and S2 front end. Then, moving along, we have new wheels, and for me, one of the biggest changes, new wing mirrors. These have a much more modern, sleek, oval design compared with the square items that were on the 944. And it's amazing how much of a difference something small like that can look. In fact, if you take off these silly side strips, the 968 really does look like a car 10 years newer than the 944. We also have new door handles with, again, the oval repeated here for the lock. That also really lifts the place. And then some of the biggest differences are actually at the back. And that's a good thing, because to me, it's at the back where the 944 required the most radical changes. The combination of the very old-looking square lights and the weird, very 1980s sort of rubber spoiler just looked dated. However, this is far more modern. The Porsche script indented here looks rather classy. The bridge spoiler, I think, is far more interesting and exciting, although probably not very aerodynamic. And the so-called soap bar lights really do lift this car and make it look much more youthful. Like its immediate predecessor, the 944 S2, the 968 was available as both coupe and convertible. But today, it's the coupe I'm going to be focusing on. The fact is, I simply wouldn't recommend the convertible to anyone. Though they are a nice enough car in their own right, the fact is, this is a platform that I don't think was ever designed to have the roof come off. It's not particularly elegant, doesn't look anywhere near as good as the coupe, and the fact is, if you want the wind in your hair, you can still have that, because this has a fully removable Targa panel. So really, it's the best of all worlds. And like all transaxles, though the back seats aren't particularly generous, the boot is. It's fairly shallow, but also quite broad and long, meaning you can get most stuff in. I've used this car for long trips a number of times, and it's been very, very good. The 968 was only ever offered with one engine, a 4-cylinder 3-litre, which is more remarkable than it may first appear, not just because of its capacity. It was one of the largest 4-cylinders in production. However, it also puts out decent power. Not quite as potent as the old turbo, but still decent. 240 PS, 225 pound-foot of torque, making it one of the torquiest engines of its type. That's 305 Newton meters. This was enough to get the car from 0 to 60 in 6.1 seconds and onto a top speed of 157 miles an hour, making it actually a little bit quicker than the Boxster that replaced it, and almost as quick as a Boxster S. As per its predecessor, this engine features a balancer shaft, making it unusually smooth for a 4-cylinder. It was also the first car to see Porsche's then new VarioCam system, variable valve timing that here is applied to the intake only, something often credited to the 993, but actually seen first here. The reason these cars have a balancer shaft is simple. In most cars, the gearbox is here, bolted directly to the back of the engine. But in these, it is here, at the rear. This is what makes it a transaxle. This isn't unique to Porsche. Many other exotic cars have used a similar layout. Ferrari, Aston Martin, Corvette, to name but a few. The benefit is improved weight distribution, but the problem is simple. To connect the two, you have a torque tube, essentially a shaft that runs from front to back. And on this, it isn't particularly big, only about so. And it's very, very sensitive to vibration, something Porsche encountered with the 924. So, in order to make sure you don't get any of that in the cabin, the engine has to be as smooth as it possibly can. A 6-cylinder was never going to fit up front, so a 4 with a balancer shaft was the solution. Fun fact, for every one of these engines that Porsche made, they had to pay a fee to the people that owned the rights to the system they were using. That was Mitsubishi. The gearbox was another element that changed. Out went the old 5-speed manual. In came a very sexy for 1992 6-speed. There was also an automatic option, a 4-speed torque converter branded as Tiptronic. It is inside where Porsche arguably did the least convincing job of making people feel like this was a new car. Anyone who's been in a late model 944 will be very familiar with the oval dash layout seen here. There are detail changes. I love, for example, the sport seats this car is equipped with. The door cards were a little bit nicer, but much of the switchgear was still familiar, and there really was no hiding the fact that this car was getting quite old. In spite of its age though, road testers clearly felt there was still plenty left in this platform because, on arrival, the 968, like its forebears, was praised for having a fabulously communicative chassis that was easy at the limit and very enjoyable all the time. I can say, even in 2023, these are still a very fun car to drive, even slowly, and, when required, can actually carry a bit more speed than you may expect. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough to convince customers, and between the fact it was, obviously, an aging platform and launched during a recession, it failed to sell well. In the 4 years it was on market, Porsche shifted just 12,766 globally, making it about a tenth as popular as its predecessor and only marginally more common than a Ferrari 355. Price is an often cited factor when discussing the relative failure of the 968, and though it was actually considerably cheaper than the old 944 Turbo, you cannot argue it presented poor value for money compared with its German rivals. The E36 BMW M3 offered more power, more cylinders, more practicality for slightly less money. it was pretty hard to argue for the 968. So, to combat this, Porsche introduced the most famous of them all, the 968 Clubsport. The recipe for the 968 Clubsport was a Porsche classic, improved performance through lightweight. They went through the car, removing many of the unnecessary luxuries, like some of the trim from the engine bay. The door cards were changed for older ones from the 944. Even the electric release for the boot was ripped out, meaning you could only access it on a right-hand drive car by opening the passenger door and then pulling a release. Out went the back seats, out went some of the other gubbins, and in came a set of nice lightweight bucket seats, new wheels, new, bigger, beefier brakes, a lower, stiffer suspension, wider tyres, and some bold script. The car could only be had in preset colours and was a hit because today they charge a lot more for it, but back then they charged about $5 grand less. The Clubsport was an instant legend. Another model lesser known but very important to mention is the UK-specific 968 Sport. You see, Porsche GB realised quite a few people were being a little bit cheeky because they were ordering their Clubsports on account of them being cheaper, then optioning back in a bunch of the luxuries like comfy seats and the like. And that really defeated the entire point of the exercise. So, Porsche GB commissioned a special run of 306 968 Sports. In specification, these were a Clubsport with all the suspension bits and bobs, but with a few luxuries added in. Generally speaking, the biggest giveaway is the comfy seats and the sport badging. However, there is something really critical to note. At the factory, these were considered to be a Clubsport. And because today the Clubsport commands the highest premium, it is not impossible for somebody to try and pass off a Sport as a Clubsport. Put in the right bits and the two would be virtually indistinguishable. It would even appear on a registry check as a Clubsport. Buyer beware. Though it has collectability on its side, to me today the 968 Clubsport is actually the one to avoid, for the very simple reason that when it was new it was the car that cost less, but today commands the greatest premium. The cheapest Clubsport on Auto Trader today was £35,000, but the cheapest regular 968 was 13. In other words, you're going to be paying nearly triple for a car that when new cost less, and the fact is, as the values of these things increase, you are far less likely to take it on track where frankly it would be fairly useless by modern standards anyway, or hoof it down a back road at ungodly speed. It is very good at doing that, and I have driven a Clubsport, but the fact is they're quite stiff, they're quite raw, they're a little bit annoying, you can't even get into the boot easily as mentioned, and I just don't get it. I love the look of them, they're great and everything, but they just aren't good value. If you want to buy one as a collector's piece, that's fine. But I'm not about cars that you buy to look at. I'm about cars that you buy to drive. And for me, the Clubsport is very quickly running away from that category. To get yourself into a good 968 today, I'd say budget around the £20,000 mark. And if you insist on having a Sport, about 25 to 30, with the Clubsport then being 35 to however much it is that you fancy paying. The thing I would say to most people is don't worry about mileage. Instead, look for service history. These are cars that were used fairly frequently. They're also 30 years old now. And though they were some of the best cars Porsche ever built, they built them a long time ago. By virtue of being the later cars that always commanded a premium compared with the 944, most of these have seen somewhat better treatment. They never achieved the £1,000 snotter status that a 1982 944 did. But because they are now 3 decades old, don't expect a trouble-free ownership experience. So then, onto some more numbers. This car is now universally regarded as a classic, meaning you should be able to get a classic insurance policy. This comes with a number of benefits, chief amongst which is lower premiums. You could have a car like this insured for £150 to £200 a year, and you can often get a guaranteed valuation, meaning if something happens to your pride and joy, you'll be paid out fairly. If you're a member of the Porsche Club of Great Britain, speak to your local representative because you can get a valuation certificate. This came with one, and you can use that to prove to your insurer just how much your pride and joy is actually worth. Regular servicing is also fairly reasonable. The official interval is every 6,000 miles, but for most people today, I think that's just going to mean do it annually. A minor service can be had from £200 to £250, but a major service varies quite a bit, from £350 to near £600. And what I've learned is the real difference between those prices is how much is actually being done. So if you have your car booked in for a major service or are getting a quotation, please make sure to ask your dealer what exactly it is that they're doing for the money, because there is quite a bit of variation. Spark plugs are fairly easy and there's only 4 of them. Likewise, brake fluid is another simple task. £100 should get you either of those. Brakes are a little more expensive, budget around £400 an axle. And a word of warning, the brakes on this are a weak point. I wouldn't shy away from any car that has had them upgraded. The clutch is a little bit more expensive. On account of the transaxle nature of the car, the labour is quite intensive, so a clutch can easily set you back around £1,000. But the good news is, with correct driving, it should last easily 100,000 miles or more. The flywheel is more of an issue. For the 968, they introduced a dual mass item, and when I managed to find the price for one, it was £2 grand. So cross your fingers, that doesn't need doing. The biggest problem really with all transaxles is the unscheduled maintenance, because there will invariably always be something that needs doing. How much needs doing and how much it's going to cost you will depend on your luck, your garage's labour rate, and how fastidious you want to be. It is for that reason I bought this particular car, because the previous owner did just 4,000 miles in it, but he spent £9,000. And I really would recommend anybody considering a transaxle Porsche of any description, certainly a 944 or 968, to budget about £2,000 a year for maintenance. Hopefully you'll get away with spending less than that most of the time, but on occasion you will need that slush fund. So what sort of thing are we talking about? Well, bushes, bearings, all the classics. The rear wheel bearing in particular is difficult because to do it properly, you actually have to remove the entire arm. On right-hand drive cars, the steering linkage runs right past the exhaust, which has a habit of drying out the grease, leading to it being a little bit graunchy. You also get things like the sunroof and window seals, which have recently been done on this. Then you've got stuff like the temperature sensor that I know has gone and is a little wire back here that just needs a clean. But to get to it, it's quite a few hours of labour. Gear linkages can go sloppy again, though it's just a few bushings that need replacement. That can easily cost you about £700. The trim around the rear can delaminate, start to fall apart. Top tip, by the way, when closing the boot on a 968, put your hands either side roughly where the pins are and put your hand down firmly, but not particularly quickly. Otherwise you do run the risk of the glass just going bang, and you don't want to know how much a new tailgate is. Then, of course, other general age-related stuff that will just wear out, fuel lines, brake lines, tyres, that sort of thing. To give you a personal example, when I bought this car, I took it to my local independent and had them go over it with a fine-toothed comb. Happily, they didn't find anything, bar the fact that the belts and chains probably were overdue. The timing belts on these are recommended to be done at 35,000 mile or 4-year intervals, and they're not particularly expensive, a few £100. But what is the internal timing chain that connects the two cams. That is known to go, the tensioners in particular are known to fail, and to do that is expensive. But less expensive than a new engine, which is what you would require if the thing failed. To get the belts and all that done along with a major service was about £1,200, and depending on your perspective, where you're coming from, that's either really good value or unbelievably expensive. Back to more good news, parts availability is generally reasonable. Things like tyres are not that expensive, £400 to £700 a set depending on your brand, and even the fuel economy is quite decent too. On one run I calculated an average of 34 to the gallon, which combined with the 74-litre fuel tank means this is an excellent long-distance cruiser.
In comparison with many other cars of the period, the 968 has also proven fairly resistant to corrosion. Even so, a check of the underbody is always worth including in any pre-sale inspection, and by removing a simple vent hidden by the door, you can get a torch into the inner sill to see if anything is lurking below. If rust has begun to show through on the exterior, particularly on the lower half of the car, it may be the tip of a crusty iceberg, so be very vigilant.
So then, who would this be the right car for? I'd actually say this is the perfect starter classic. Anybody that's been thinking about dipping their toe into the wonderful world of old motoring, I think would be very well served by a 968. Provided you don't need the back seats for anyone adult, this is a fabulous all-rounder. It has, I think, quite good looks. It's aged very well. It's reasonably rare, yet not impossible to get bits for or to work on, and it's a fairly well-loved model with a lot of support and backup from the likes of the Porsche Club, George and Caitlin up here in Scotland. If you're hearing a Porsche, come and see them, please. They've been amazing people and love to support any other enthusiasts of the brand. Aside from that, it's got a good boot, the aforementioned range, reasonable fuel economy, so to drive and put miles on a car like this shouldn't actually be all that daunting. You can even get, and I've yet to fit mine, I have got one, a classic nav system for the car that gives you more modern functionality but is in keeping with the rest of the cabin. And it's that kind of attention to detail that I really appreciate from Porsche. Alternatives? Well, I suppose now, as ever, the M3 has to be considered. And for this kind of money, you could get E36, E46, or even E92, worryingly, though that really isn't a fair comparison, is it? E36, I think, is the most direct rival. Those, I think, are almost certain to have had a harder life, but there are also more of them to choose from. There may be a little bit less special, a little bit less of an occasion, but still very fun with a mega engine, particularly if you get the later Evo. And of course, they'll be more practical with their big boot and back seats that a real human can actually fit in, as fancy M3 owners. Maybe the most direct rival that I can think of, and probably more applicable to American viewers, is the FC generation Mazda RX-7. That's the one that looks almost exactly like a 944, has that peppy, crazy little rotary engine, but here in Britain, they're virtually extinct. Great cars. In some ways, they feel a little bit more sports car than this. You feel lower down with a wider cabin. They're a great drive, really quite sensational, but they drink like a fish, will cost at least as much as one of these to run, and parts and support here in Britain just isn't going to be anywhere near as good. A fun, but still somewhat sensible alternative, the first generation Jaguar XK. But most of the things I've said about this car, all the prices I've quoted, double them. It's not a cheap car to run, the old XK. Like this, it was built on a very old platform, but one they tried to disguise a little bit more. And because those were also run as cheap cars for quite a long time, they can be quite expensive now. And that's a shame because I really do love them. Fabulous looking things with a great engine. However, exclusively with an automatic gearbox that I'm sure has already put loads of you off. But a great GT, although somehow, despite the fact they're quite a bit bigger than this, I think they have even less room in them. Don't know how Jaguar managed that, but that would be my fun but sensible alternative. So there we have it. That's a little bit about the Porsche 968. What would you like to see featured next in this series? Please let me know in the comment section down below. And until then, thank you for watching. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.